controversial Kenyan church leader has come under fire after allegedly convincing his congregants to starve themselves to death so they could go to heaven. Paul Mackenzie is currently in police custody and faces charges of murder for over 100 people, including children. Meanwhile, another religious leader in that country, that's Ezekiel Odero, was released on bail after being accused of aiding suicide and abduction. Both leaders are under scrutiny for their involvement in a religious cult that's led to hundreds of deaths. But how do these cults emerge in our communities, and how does one tell if they're part of one? Professor Farid Esack is with the Religious Studies Department at the University of Johannesburg and joins us now via our video link for some of his thoughts. Prof, it's lovely to see you. Thanks so much indeed for making time to speak to us. It really is a tricky story in some respects, isn't it? Because faith by its very nature actually rationalizes and gives meaning to pain and suffering. In fact, in some instances, it projects these as a way to salvation. The obvious question is, where do we draw the line?
Well, the question is whether lines can in fact be drawn, because both in terms of the definition of cult, if you look at traditional religions, in some ways they can all be said to have started off as cults, and at some point they became sects inside a mainstream religious tradition, and at another stage they became the actual religious tradition. So that's the one problem. The other problem is that in terms of the rights, certainly in the human rights-oriented society such as ours, if you limit the definition of what a cult may be, you could well interfere with a number of different rights of people, the rights of association, the freedom of speech, this on the one hand. And on the other hand, if you give it too broad a definition, it may give some what we would regard as dangerous or abusive groups a limitless excuse for avoiding all legal obligations. And so it can only be defined in a particular point, in a particular society's context. It's not possible to come up with a definition that applies to all societies and across time.
Yeah. And I suppose where you start really matters. From your experience, are we able to have meaningful discussions about this in circular sessions or sections of society? In other words, are these communities or discussions that need to take place accepting some of the rules that these religious groups have taken on, if we are to make any headway? I'm not sure if my question is coming across clear enough.
Yes, no, I understand that. Now, look, we need to understand that discussion implies that people think, that people exchange ideas, that people have a common language, and that they have common values from which they depart. And so from the get-go, then, a discussion in the real sense of the word, or in the rational sense of the word, necessarily excludes the cults themselves. So what then are we left with? We're left with a rational language, we're left with a constitutional language, we're left with a discourse of give and take. And in this regard, yes, it's the only way in which our society functions. Whether we talk to traditional leaders or religious leaders, or as intellectuals or at election rallies, it's the only language that we have. And so those elements in society, whether it is the judicial elements, the legal, these elements that I mentioned, they at least have to come together and agree on what in fact are harmful for society at a larger social level, and more particularly at a legal level. Because ultimately, as an organized polity or the leadership of society, we can only intervene at the legal level, and at other levels, whether it's community or civil society or the churches, we can only intervene at an advisory level, at a conscientizing level, but we don't have any legal authority over these entities other than, do they break the law or don't they break the law?
Correct.
Has somebody been harmed or not?
Yeah, and whether that harm is rational, right? And again, that opens us to discussions about what rationality looks like in the context of faith. The other, I suppose, complexity here is there's a real risk of anthropologizing the people who are involved in these practices, right? And I think in many instances, that may also lead to them being misunderstood. How do we guard against something like that?
Well, the one is, when you see people, for example, on a late Saturday night or around midnight on a Saturday, gathering at a little koppie or something, or people on Table Mountain going to collect herbs or operating there on the edges of the mountain. There may be a fire danger. In fact, it is a fire danger, but they are rather benign. We can look at them with some bemusement or some kind of condescension and so on. That's fine. However, once we give those elements a social recognition in our structures, then it becomes problematic, because they use that then to entrench their own legitimacy in the eyes of their followers. And of course, the problem then is that we have no knowledge, no insight into the relationship between them and their followers, other than when there is a huge explosion through death or through sex scandals or through financial extortion. It's only then that we begin to see what is the relationship inside. And so I don't know, but I think I lean towards the side that on the one hand they're right, but on the other hand you don't wait until all the murders have occurred and then suddenly wake up and, oh my God, what have we done? Even then there is a rush to condemn, a rush to. And after this case that we had in Gauteng, the Mpoba ministry, wherein 5 policemen and 3 of the brothers were killed just about 4 years ago. Until now, we've had nothing about that case any further. It's been more than 2 years now, but at the time when it happened, it was a huge hullabaloo about it. So it is quite problematic, but I also don't know if it is inevitable. If you look at the Bester case, the Bester escape case, everybody's talking about it now. And at the same time, there is no focus on how the prison system in general is still a system that is virtually on the point of collapse, because we're paying attention to the drama. And I'm afraid, but it is the same with the cases with not so much the cult, but when the cult get exposed, then we begin to think, oh my God, the cult have a problem. But this is not sufficient to actually get us to have a serious conversation about what cults are doing, what is a benign cult, how far can we stretch the question of human rights on the one hand and social cohesion on the other hand. There's little serious discussion happening in the country at the moment. Yeah,
that's fascinating. As I mentioned at the beginning of our discussion, the church leader in this particular case is currently in police custody and is facing murder charges. But outside of the legal system, there's going to be a lot of discussion around how do we assign culpability in a context where perhaps nobody was forced to be part of this, but also in a context where for many staunch religious people, maybe Christians more specifically, part of what these congregants conceded to doesn't sound unfamiliar at the very least. Christian literature speaks a lot about martyrs who willingly go into positions or situations that put their lives at risk. Do you have a way of thinking through that kind of complexity?
No, not just Christianity. Other religious traditions as well. Certainly Islam. The whole idea of martyrdom for the cause of truth. And here again, the question of, did those religions then mainstream themselves, or for want of a better word, were they mainstreamized? Yes, Christianity became part of a mainstream. Islam became part of a mainstream. But if you go to Latin America, you consider the enactment of Easter weekend, where people engage in self-flagellation, Latin America, in the Philippines, in some parts of the Muslim world, you see when they commemorate the martyrdom of the Prophet's grandson, they engage in self-flagellation and all covered in blood. So that doesn't qualify as a cult. Why not? Because it is embedded in a mainstream religion. And at the same time, when we look at the cult doing those things, now of course in those mainstream, the Passover enactment, or for Muslims, for Shia Muslims, the Muharram reenactment, it doesn't involve death. So sacrifice has come to mean a different thing in contemporary religion. Earlier on with the Crusades, for example, or with Muslims, and of course when you look at ISIS and Al-Qaeda, not mainstream Muslims, but they also invoke the question of sacrifice and go there and go and die, yearning in fact to die. So in earlier stages it was different, and in contemporary I think it is different. Now you may say that Al-Qaeda is also a cult, or ISIS is also a cult, and in some ways it is. Except that there isn't a centrality of one particular leader. So yes, there is a tension between what is the mainstream religion in all of this. I mean, if you look at Mackenzie in East Africa, formal education is satanic. Okay, many of our religious leaders still argue that formal education is satanic. Education is an evil because it promotes what he calls gayism and lesbianism. Many of our, I mean, right up to former Chief Justice Mogoeng, he would happily support this, you know, stay away from schools because children are taught about gayism and lesbianism. Mothers must seek medical attention through childbirth and not through hospital. People should not vaccinate their children. All of these issues came up in the context of, in our quote-unquote, very civilized society, right, and mainstream religious leaders. So, in some ways, there's nothing unique about them, except that they're out of step with the contemporary mainstream religiosity or religious formations in our society today.
Sure. Fascinating stuff. In fact, as you're speaking, I'm reminded of, the definition of Boko Haram, which is apparently Western education is forbidden. So there's certainly something to be said about what raises eyebrows in some sectors and what doesn't. Professor Farid Esack, it's been lovely speaking to you. Thank you so much indeed for sharing with us what you can, given the time we have, to unpack this very complex issue. Professor Farid is with the Religious Studies Department at the University of Johannesburg.